Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I am your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very senior corporate leader from Shanghai, China, Mr. Cameron Johnson. Cameron, welcome to the show.
Ash, thanks for having me. It's looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Cameron is the partner Tidalwave Solutions, and he's a professor at NYU Shanghai. So, Cameron, let's talk about Tidalwave Solutions. Tell me a little bit about what you do here.
Sure. My career started 20 some years ago in China, and then after so many years of kind of working for somebody else, I decided, you know what, I want to go have my own business. If I'm going to work that much, I should take the advantage of, the opportunity and the money that comes with it. So, Tidalwave Solutions actually is split in two. One part of the company is focused on HR and recruitment and those kind of services. I run the management consulting side, which is what a management consultant does, and everything you can imagine.
And you're also in supply chains.
Yes, our major focus on the consulting side is supply chains, manufacturing, and the kind of on the back end technology that deals with all of that.
Wonderful. So today we'll talk about supply chains because not only has it become very, very critical, but every world leader now suddenly has supply chain in their speeches. So let me start by asking you a very basic question. When I was starting life in the corporate world 4 decades ago, there used to be a purchase manager whose primary job was to make sure goods arrived on time at the right price. That has now evolved into the chief supply chain officer. Give me your perspective on how has this function evolved over the years?
No, you're right. And, I like to say before the pandemic, nobody knew the word supply chains, and now everybody does. So it's actually helpful in the business. I think you're right. Historically, when you were a purchasing manager at a business, your goal was to get the product to the business at the right price. And generally, you may have known your suppliers, but that was about it. You didn't generally know where the product came from unless, it was a locally produced product. To your point, now it's evolved into much more than that. As a chief supply chain officer, or even as a supply chain manager, you have to know not only where your product comes from and who's involved in the process, but also all the different cost structures of all the different businesses involved with it, because any change, for example, raw material goes up, energy goes up, as we've seen, the price of gasoline goes up, all of that will change the dynamics in your business automatically. So you have to kind of watch a whole picture versus more of a simplistic one.
Well said. And, over the last 3 years, because of the pandemic, what has changed that requires companies to rethink their entire supply chain to ensure business continuity?
Yeah, basically, it boils down to not being able to get products or materials in a timely manner, and then the chaos that puts into a business. So, there's many companies now looking for, how do I reduce my risk, right? Not just of interruptions, but also these huge price increases or goods shortages that we've seen across the board.
Interesting. You're based in China, and China is a very, very significant player in the supply chain business. And yet there have been certain uncertainties around the world because of challenges of COVID and shipping, etc. What should companies be now thinking of to reduce their reliance on large suppliers like China and increase their own share of domestic procurement and production?
So I'm going to take a slightly different tact. Trying to reverse, decades of what we would consider or call globalization isn't going to work. And there's a lot of reasons for it. I'll give an example. We live in a global community, and supply chains generally are global. If you think about semiconductor chips, right, which, India, the US, of course, with the new CHIPS Act, everybody's trying to do new chip factories and figure out how do we make chips locally. But as an example, if you look at the supply chain of chips, chip ingots are produced in Japan, then they're sent to the States and processed through several steps, then shipped back to Asia for packaging, right? Then put into an electronic component, maybe an iPhone or something in China, and then shipped to the consumer. So which part of the process are you going to put in your country? Are you going to put all of those processes? Well, that creates not just inefficiency in the system, but massive cost increases.
Well said.
And so, yeah, so what we're seeing actually is a bit of a spreading out of risk. So you may have another step in the process, right? Or you may have another component of the supply chain closer to you, so you can mitigate some of that risk. But we're not really seeing a broad, domestic procurement of materials and supply chains, because it just is very challenging to do.
Interesting. And you just spoke about risk. My next question is about how can a supply chain head mitigate risk?
So as a supply chain head, the first thing I look at when I do this is supply chain mapping. Again, starting, I guess in the US we'd say CYA, it means cover yourself, right? Yeah. So if you don't, for example, if you're making this cup right here, okay. You may not necessarily need to know, okay, the raw material came from this mine in Australia. You don't need to know that, right? Because it's not really pertinent. But you may need to know, hey, where in the steps, what steps in the process do I actually need to understand where my product came from? Did it come from this type of factory? Did the factory outsource some of the production, right? Where did it go in that process until it hit my warehouse or my inventory? And so we're seeing a lot of that. The other is what options are available. So for example, a lot of businesses, particularly before the pandemic, may have had only one or two sources of products. Now they're looking for multiple sourcing, maybe 3 or 4 different suppliers, so they can mitigate that risk, not just by geography, but also by the types of businesses they deal with.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit about technology now. How have you seen technology beginning to change supply chains?
So one of the challenges in supply chains is I just references visibility, right? And also tracking. And so that deals with everything from quality control to cost control to, oftentimes compliance, right? Particularly if you have sensitive materials or products. So that is what we're starting to see in terms of changing warehousing, and also what we would consider the logistics side of supply chains is kind of that tracking and traceability component that is now no longer just a simple inventory system, right, that a Walmart might use or FedEx, but actually now smart real-time technology components that can tell you exactly where your product is in the process.
And I've been speaking to several supply chain leaders around the world. One question I ask all of them is, how do you see artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, drones in the development and use of supply chains?
So we don't quite know yet, because all of those areas I would say are in its infancy, both in terms of there's not a lot of companies that have these products or have this technology rolled out. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is, how do you effectively put all of them together, right? You referenced a warehousing, for example. So let's imagine, again, you're making a product, and if everything was connected in real time, your system, or even as a manager, you would be notified, hey, this product in my store in New Delhi, for example, is going low. I know it's going to take me 3 weeks to get new products in. I need to notify the factory now, right? Instead of what usually happens is somebody looks at an inventory list and says, oh my gosh, we're low, right? That's more of a manual step. So we're going to start to see a lot of this put together. And then that notification automatically, again, would go to the supplier, and the supplier would just automatically start making products. So it would become more of a seamless process.
Very interesting. And do you see drones getting in for last mile of the supply chains?
Potentially, but I think it's much more feasible, at least I'd say in the next decade, for drones to do more business to business, right? You're a large warehouse or factory, it's easier to ship stuff to maybe a distribution center, as an example, versus what I think a lot of people want is, hey, something just, a box just gets dropped off at my door and that's it, I'm ready to go. So I think we're a long way away from that just because it's too complex, but I think definitely business to business drone operations is something that we'll see.
Interesting. Let's now move to another part of the supply chain, which is from the perspective of the consumer. What has happened in the pandemic is that supply chains have become so efficient that consumers have started getting what they need in 30 minutes. I wanted to get your perspective on how have these e-commerce platforms impacted the functioning of efficient supply chains?
That's a great question. On the one hand, it forces suppliers to continually improve their processes, right? Because customers are unhappy if it doesn't get to my door in 30 minutes. On the other, it has also created a lot of challenges for how do you maintain that. One of the things we saw, as you really pointed out, particularly in the US, for example, during the pandemic, is people did get used to Amazon Prime and things showing up. And when those disruptions happen, then what do you do?
Correct.
Right. So we're also seeing, though, more of a predictive, and you referenced AI and various technologies. So we're also seeing more AI used. So as an example, we know certain products will move at certain times of the year, or such a certain event happens. So we know that coinciding with that, certain products will see an uptick. So we are starting to see some businesses use an AI component to predict, maybe too strong of a term, but to kind of, help along that process so they can build more with that. I would say also one of the things that it has done for suppliers is, particularly if you're a small business, how are you going to compete with a large business? It's getting product out faster, cheaper, easier than the other guys. And so this is actually something that we've seen, particularly here in China and Asia, where homegrown smaller businesses are actually, battling the big guys in a great way because they're able to take advantage of that platform.
And, you mentioned about the US and Prime. So let me ask you a question relating to that. I was in the US in summer, and I was asking my son, if I ordered something on Prime, how long would it take? And he says, typically about 2 days. And I said, well, in India, I get it in a few hours. What is your perspective on what makes Asian supply chain seem to move much faster than what I experienced in the US?
I think there's a few things. One, we have no legacy systems, right? When you look at a U.S. postal service in America, right? That was traditionally how you got mail.
Yeah.
Amazon, FedEx, UPS, these guys came along. Those are legacy systems. They have massive warehouses. They have all of these distribution centers. Asia generally doesn't have that. Now we have it for some, of course, but we are able to build indigenous systems that fit our own needs. The other thing is just the mass scale. So you're in Delhi. What's the population of Delhi? 20 million, maybe?
Well, 24 million, yeah.
Yeah, Shanghai's 30 million. And we're the same. I mean, we can order, I can order a new tie and have it here either tonight or tomorrow morning, right? Yep. I think, again, economies of scale and the ability to innovate and maneuver on the fly and not being beholden to the old ways of thinking or to old systems that are entrenched. And so this is an advantage that Asia has over anybody else at the moment.
One more question about the supply chain relating to warehouse, and then I'll move to something else. The warehousing around the world is changing quite dramatically. I wanted to understand from you, what do you see as the warehouse of the future?
I think we'll see, it'll be different in different places. I think in Asia, for example, we'll see rich hub and spoke, where you will have, large hubs, like in the Shanghai area, there's a massive hub. And then you'll have little distribution centers or other things related to that. We're also seeing that with food, right? Where you'll have huge food distributions, and then they will kind of have satellite operations in other places. But again, I think how I answer that question and think about it is, what are we not seeing? Because the needs of today will not be the needs of tomorrow.
Correct.
And so again, in Asia, we're actually able to pivot and deal with it much more effectively, I would argue, than the US or Europe or Japan or other places that have entrenched systems. So I think what I do look for is just access, right? How can we have access? And that doesn't mean 30 minutes, it's great to have that access, but particularly in terms of our population sizes, how do we realistically have access and also, good quality material and products? And I think that is what we're starting to see happen.
And is there a role you see of governments to support or help supply chains?
So I think government has a critical role in developing the support structure and ecosystem. So I'll give you an example. If you look at if you look at countries that have dominant manufacturing, why is that? They have basically 6 key areas that they support. One is manufacturing ecosystem of suppliers. You have raw material access, favorable policies, educated and skilled talent, infrastructure that's usually advanced, and then technology. And so, government has a role in almost all of those areas. And a lot of it, again, has to do with supporting just the underlying platform or infrastructure that all of that supports.
And in a market, I mean, I've been to China many, many times. I've always seen somehow that China seems to build the infrastructure before it starts anything else. And that seems to support supply chains dramatically.
Yes, we call it the ecosystem effect, right? Where, they'll build a port and then everybody will kind of, move factories or have production around the port. Tesla here in Shanghai is an example. They're right at the port. And that's one of the reasons they put their facility here. Yes, some people say it's predictive. I say it's more just understanding that if you want to be influential and have key industries in your area, that's what you have to do. Is you have to have an ecosystem, and an ecosystem has some variation of those 6 parts. So they've kind of seen it at, hey, wait a minute. It started down south, close to Hong Kong, right? Shenzhen and Dongguan, in that area in Guangzhou. And then you have key areas in the country that they've used this model in. And yet, to your point, it's actually bloomed and forced. It's now forcing other countries and other entities to look at this system and say, hey, wait a minute, this is an opportunity for us.
Well said. Let me now move to your avatar as a professor at NYU Shanghai. Tell me about the areas that you teach.
So I teach a couple areas. One is focused on project management. I teach a capstone, which is, as you know, is kind of the final course that students go through in order to graduate. Then I also teach classes on managing in a global economy and then leadership as well. So we have kind of 3 key areas. And so I love it. It's one of the things I'm passionate about. Similar to yourself, I like to give back in that way, particularly having been in Asia since I was a kid. But also working for both, Asian, including Chinese and Western firms, and kind of bring in that whole, holistic approach and around, global approach to how do we really solve the problems that we're facing today as a society.
Very interesting. So Cameron, now I'm going to move to a few questions for you personally, because our viewers and listeners love to get to know the guest a little better. Let me start by asking you, what would you say are 3 key milestones in your life or your career?
I'd say the first would be going to China. Again, I came as a kid. I graduated college early at 19 and then came here. And I was only going to come here for a year, but then I came and never left. So, so that would be first. I think the second really would be being part of the American Chamber of Commerce here. And I would encourage, people to kind of look at it broadly and say a professional organization. It gave me great opportunities to not just network, but also to go speak to policymakers, in a different capacity. And then really the third, course is, running my own business, because then it is only you and you have to figure everything out. And that actually, I learned far more running my own business, Ash, than I ever did in my MBA courses. And so I think, those kind of 3 aspects of, how they've kind of influenced me.
Wonderful. And what would you say are some of the core values you believe in?
So, I'm a Baha'i, so we believe very much in cooperation, consultation, and I'm very much interested in that, particularly being in Asia where we have so many diverse cultures and peoples and languages. The only way we're going to solve challenges and problems is by that cooperation, and consultation. The next is really being involved. How do you solve problems? Well, it's through action. You have to be involved. Whether you're talking about government policies, the CHIPS Act, for example, in the States, I gave some feedback on that to the powers that be. You have to be involved, and it doesn't mean you have to be at front and center, but you have to contribute in some way. And then really the last is, kind of the golden rule. Always try to help people. It doesn't matter if you get something out of it then or not. But I found definitely in my career, particularly as a teacher, the more I give back, the more I actually feel, that not only I've contributed, but that I'm helping, others also solve the challenges that they face.
Wonderful. I have time for 2 more questions. So my next question is, what does success mean to Cameron?
Oh man, these are life challenging questions here.
Why not?
Success to me really, in my work, it's solving problems and helping the customer or the product move forward. And then in my teaching, it would definitely, again, kind of, helping students through to the next evolution of their career, or even, students who've graduated and taken my classes in the past, again, helping them resolve the challenges so they can be, bigger, better, more effective.
Interesting. And my last question to you, and this is for the many, many people who will listen to our conversation, based on your amazing experience, vast experience in China, Asia, US, what would you say are 3 lessons you would want our viewers and listeners to take away from this conversation?
I'd say for the first, when you talk about supply chains,
Mm-hmm.
the problems truly generally are global.
Mm-hmm.
So to resolve them actually requires not just outside the box thinking, but truly thinking about it on a global level, right?
Yeah.
I think too often we get too focused on just our own area and not,
Yeah.
hey, this is a global challenge. So the second would be, the more you help others,
Mm-hmm.
the more actually you're going to be better off. And again, it's something I'm passionate about. And then kind of
Yeah.
the third is, the challenges of today are just
Mm-hmm.
beginning. And so the only way we're going to really resolve them is, again, through that kind of cooperation,
Yeah.
consultation, working together. So
very interesting. On that note, Cameron, and your 3 amazing lessons, most problems are generally global. I think therefore people need to start thinking global. The more you help others, the better off you will be, because you can then ask for help and you can seek help. And the third one is that challenges are just beginning, and there's a lot of need to be cooperating and collaborating with others. Thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me at such length about the supply chains, the impact on the world, how things are beginning to change, what your thoughts are on warehousing. And finally, thank you also for speaking to me about what you teach. Thank you again, and good luck to you.
thank you. Look forward to doing it again.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.